Ladies and gentlemen, part 3. This is the greatest trilogy of interviews that have ever existed. Maybe not the greatest trilogy of interviews ever. I don't even know what I just said there. But Ben, thank you so much, as always, for joining me to speak about the takeover of Manchester United. Now, our first interview that we had, we really went in depth, didn't we? And we spoke about the Qatari side of things. JBJ, we coined that. I still need to start using it. I keep going by his full name, but we'll speak about what's coming on from the Qatari side of things. Over developments of the last few days have come, Ben, around the Glazers and the fact that the bids that have gone in from JBJ and the 92 Foundation and Ineos and Sir Jim Ratcliffe are lower than the Glazers want. The Glazers are infighting. Joel and Avram, they don't want to cede control, whilst their siblings, they want to sell. What are you hearing? I think the main thing I'd like to speak to you about is what are you hearing from the Qatari side of things? How are they seeing these developments over this last week? Because Kavi Solihull from Sky Sports is reporting that Sheikh Jassim bin Hamad Al Thani is still very determined to buy Manchester United.
Well, I think first of all, good to be back.
Yeah, welcome back. That was a long intro.
3 times. Surely I get posted a hat-trick ball with a Manchester United logo on it. And congratulations, of course, to Manchester United on winning the League Cup as well, which is a mood lifter. And I think a statement of intent. It feels like a new era, and to beat Barcelona and to win the League Cup in the same week is magnificent for the football club. And it was really quite moving, I think, to see the club come together generationally and watch Alex Ferguson waiting for Erik ten Hag in the tunnel, because that embraced in a microcosm is what Manchester United represent and where they need to be. And Ten Hag has to find a way, whether with the Glazers or under new ownership, to define Manchester United based on their future, not on their past. So with all of the glory that comes with the past, but with all of these modern tweaks on the football side and the foundational side that keep the club challenging for glory and winning trophies, which is why I think the first one in the trophy cabinet is so significant. So congratulations to Manchester United with the takeover. Let me preface this by saying 2 things. One, we're recording this on a Wednesday morning, and a lot can change over the course of the next 48 hours if you are watching this a little bit later. And the second thing to say is headlines will always make out like there's been twists, turns, delays, but this is very much what all of the groups expected. And from the word go, I've said one thing very simply, which is there's an S in Glazers. And it's been obvious from the very beginning of this process that the family are not unified, and they're not going to become unified until they've digested the offers and the process is a little bit further along. And that is why you're going to get a lot of competing narratives, some saying the Glazers have reservations, others saying it's a divided family. But the bottom line here is that any indicative offer is not like a transfer. It's not there to win the club overnight. The indicative offers are about groups formally entering the process in a very simple paragraph and showing they've got proof of funds. And then from there, waiting to see whether they're put through for due diligence, at which point they formulate a far more accurate picture of the club. And then based on other takeovers, the price can go significantly up or down, or of course, stay the same. But they're bidding to an extent blind at the moment. Although they've seen some top line data, they have to actually access the full club's numbers to determine whether or not the bid remains competitive. And the beauty here is that because you work with financial insiders and lawyers, and all of these groups are experts in doing these type of transactions, they will have a sense of what Manchester United is worth. And it may not be too far off the reality. Financial insiders have always said that twice the Chelsea price, which would be 4.6 billion. The Chelsea price was 2.3 billion. Some say 2.5, but my understanding is it was reduced slightly in the latter stages of due diligence, which is very normal. So if we take it at 2.3 billion, that's 4.6 billion. A lot of people within the industry, financial insiders, lawyers, football experts, those close to the bidding groups, believe that that's phenomenal value. And yet we keep hearing this number of 6 billion plus from the Glazers. And you have to wrap your head around this stage of the process is about 2 things: credible or non-credible. And that is more important than win or lose or accepted and rejected. It's about being put through, not about winning. And that is because it is likely that more than one group will be put through. And also the likes of Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Sheikh Jassim are not intent on showing their top offer or going higher than they need to at this stage, because it's a business transaction and they're trying to get the best possible value. And as a consequence, we shouldn't read too much into anything until the due diligence is done, because at that point, a parity or an equality between the Glazers and the groups will be established. And by that, I mean, the Glazers right now are pushing a high number, even if they're not explicitly stating it. And that's one, because Joe Ravitch at Rain Group has told them entering this process can get them that number and they trust him. And two, because they're trying to create a bidding war between different groups and get the highest possible number. And that might be the quickest route to family unity and getting an outright sale. Otherwise, they may choose minority investment, perhaps all along. That is their preference, certainly in the case of Joel and Avram. We're going to have to wait and see. But we shouldn't be jumping the gun here, because even though the process could wrap up quite fast as it snowballs, at this point, procedurally speaking, we're in a very formative stage. So until the feedback is established, the Glazers are at an advantage. And by parity and equality, what I mean is the Glazers know all of Manchester United's numbers. So either they want a high number because they're trying to get the best possible deal, which is obvious, and there's gamesmanship around that, or they believe that their valuation is true, and that's because they've seen all the numbers. Whereas with Jim Ratcliffe and Sheikh Jassim, they've not seen anything significant and in-depth at the club. So they may look at those numbers if they're put through for due diligence and say, actually, the Glazers are right. We're prepared to go up by 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. Or they may say, we've looked at the numbers and we're sticking to our guns, or we're going down. So it's a game at the moment, because if the Glazers don't want to sell, then if they put outright bidders through, it sends the opposite message, that they are prepared to do a deal. And then the groups, should they be put through, will take confidence in that and say, okay, they've put us through, which means this whole narrative around skepticism, around doubt, around wanting to try and stay and wait is obviously undermined somewhat by the fact that they've gone and put an outright bidder through under 5 billion. If they reject those outright bidders, it's the opposite. That sends a real statement of intent that perhaps they don't want to sell.
From the Qatari perspective, is there anything you're hearing about? Is it going exactly how they expected it to at this stage? They're not sitting there, they're not worried about the Glazers posturing with 6 billion. They sort of expected this sort of response at this point.
Well, the most underrated point and clue in all of this is actually from a PR perspective, believe it or not, because the PR firm that are releasing statements on behalf of Sheikh Jassim have surrendered a contract with the Premier League in order to work on the Qatari bid. And yes, they're well compensated, but if this only lasts for a month and they give up an account with the league, which is ongoing, then that's not a smart business decision, unless they feel that obviously they're going to be well rewarded, but it's a long-term thing. So that tells you that Sheikh Jassim has got confidence in hiring that firm, that this is going to progress over the coming months. And even if they come into the club, maybe that contract can even go beyond it. So I'm not saying read too much into that, but from my experience, when a group starts using PR to release statements rather than doing it in-house, which is what Sir Jim Ratcliffe is doing through their public statements, it tells you that they believe there's a relationship to be had. And if you flip that the other way, when the PR firm chooses to take on the account, knowing it's a conflict of interest with the Premier League, and they decide to take Sheikh Jassim over the Premier League, even though that was an existing client, that may be a clue. And certainly in legal circles, if a firm takes on a new client, it can be an indication if they have choices and conflicts and they have to pick between A or B. The one they take on is usually done so because there's money to be made, yes, but also because they think it's a long-standing and lucrative account, not a fleeting thing. So Sheikh Jassim has always been confident. One thing I'd point out is that we can call it the Qatari bid, and I think that before we had a name to put to it, that was fine. But sources close to Sheikh Jassim see this very much as Sheikh Jassim bidding as a Manchester United fan, as a private individual through a private foundation. And part of that is because they obviously want to create separation between any links with QIA or other senior figures. And it is obviously true that the strategy behind all of this is driven effectively from the Emir, but they don't see themselves as Qatar. They very much see this as Sheikh Jassim, a private individual. And that is a semantics point. And that is because we're moving from the bid to the group. And I think, as I said on your last show, when it is a bid, it's about a strategy that required a lot of senior stakeholders within Qatar to effectively green light it. Now it's a group. A lot of those people step back. And that's why now we're hearing more about Sheikh Jassim rather than Qatar more broadly. And it's up to people in practical terms. And when the makeup of the group is more clarified, to determine themselves whether they think this is an individual that loves Manchester United or whether this is Qatar. And the truth is, it's probably going to be a bit of both. But Sheikh Jassim's always been confident in the number of his indicative offer, in the makeup of his group, and the 9-2 Foundation will be clarified imminently if they're put through to due diligence, and feedback is expected this week. We may already have got some feedback by the time some people watch this show, but we have to wait and see, because Rain, the Glazers and the groups have never put a timescale on it. So this transfer orientated notion of big offer, it's going to be accepted, so-and-so is going to win, it'll be done by March. In a best case scenario, that can happen in a takeover because you can get a standout bidder, they can become the preferred group, they can enter into an exclusive period, and things can proceed rapidly. But the Glazers don't have to treat this like Roman Abramovich did with Chelsea. There's no urgency. And the power dynamic of a takeover shifts as well. So even if the Glazers pushed this as fast as they could, if you then got to a scenario where a group enters due diligence and or a period of exclusivity, and they say, we want to slow things down, we want to comb through your numbers, we've got a ton of questions about the debt, we're still working on our own strategy and dynamic, then the Glazers have to cede to that as well. So takeovers are two-way processes. Right now, Rain have got all the power and everyone's waiting on their feedback. But as a group becomes more advanced, if that scenario occurs, they gain the power to say to the Glazers, we're doing this a bit more on our terms. So right from day one, those close to Sheikh Jassim said it will take as long as it takes. There's not this delay narrative in their head. There's not this twist notion that the Glazers have moved from a March completion to now an end of season completion. It's always been the case from all sides, at least who I've spoken to, that it will take as long as it takes, because that's just how a takeover works. It's not an easy process. You don't just bid and then get the keys to the club. It's not like renting or doing a deal on deadline day where if your offer is sufficient, then you're in very quickly with a signature. It takes a number of lawyers, a number of strategic meetings, a number of back and forth. The price will change come what may. And that's why we have to be very cautious about reading too much into these indicative offers.
I think, I suppose a major point of concern for United fans, it's something that we all knew was going to happen. And it's always been the case of the Glazers' ownership of the club, is the lack of unity inside the Glazers as a family the whole way through. Joel and Avram, they tried to buy out the four other siblings during the summer when they tried to get investment from Apollo, which they weren't successful in doing. Pretty much the entire way through of their ownership of Manchester United, we've been slow in transfer markets because we've had to get approval from Joel. We've had to jump through the hurdles, and it's always been an issue. And now at the point of sale, the issue still exists on the wider scale of the idea that Joel and Avram want to maintain control. And obviously, Avram being at Wembley, is that something that we should look into, or is that going to be their own version of PR? You know, in the same way that Sheikh Jassim may have hired his own PR firm, Avram Glazer would have went there for a specific set of reasons. He would have been advised to be at that game for a specific set of reasons. I can't say what those are, but he's decided to give the public face of him being the owner of Manchester United at the point where, look, and the crazy thing is that, look, we've just beaten Barcelona and we've just won the League Cup final. And in the same week, the share price has dropped another 10%. If not, I think it's dropped more than that, actually. It's around about where it was when they first announced that the club was up for sale back in November. So the artificial high that was created from the Qatari buzz has sort of lessened a little bit around the concept that the Glazers might not sell. Do you think that is something that United fans do have to worry about? Or is just because it's Manchester United, because it's the scale of what it is, there's daily updates. There's always going to be scrutiny that goes the whole way through, and it's a bit more public.
There's always market manipulation and takeover manipulation, and a false high of being linked to a very rich Qatari group, or people assuming that they were rich at the time, led to a spike in the share price, and that was always going to level off. So it is a little bit perhaps surprising that it didn't go up rather than down in the days after the League Cup final win, but by the same token, it was already inflated to a false high because of the soft deadline, and therefore it coming down and leveling off and returning to more of a constant was likely. But I think with Avram Glazer being at the League Cup final, first of all, he had to be there. It's a League Cup final, first trophy under a new era. If you're not present during that key moment of Erik ten Hag lifting a first trophy, then you're almost by implication saying you're distant from that new era, which Manchester United fans might celebrate and like, but Avram Glazer has to just continue to paint a picture of business as usual, an investment in Manchester United. First of all, because regardless of what happens, the Glazers have to stay invested between now and the end of the season, and planning is still taking place to some degree on key parts of the club because you work windows ahead. So whoever's money you're spending in the summer, the football department still have to work on a transfer window at the moment based on Champions League football. And again, the Glazers will want to be part of a renewal of Marcus Rashford's contract as well. And Manchester United can't afford to just wait until the summer or beyond and say, we'll pass that on to new ownership. If they've got the budget to do that, then towards the end of this season, they need to start talking to Marcus Rashford. Otherwise, another club can ultimately come in. So the Glazers have to act as business guardians of the football club and do so in a way that shows passion and investment. And if they're undecided, they almost have to give more of a show of that commitment to the football club to try and win over some of the fan base. But it was telling that even during a League Cup final, there were anti-Glazers banners and there was regular chanting against the ownership group. So that's a message again to the Glazers that the fan base want them out. And that's off the back of ultimately a series of fails within the club that start from the top and go all the way down. It's down to frustration at the level of funding. And I think fans also can see now that there's foundational issues with the club. There's a modernization needed with the football club as well. And when you add all of that up, and then the Ronaldo saga, which overshadowed the summer, the managerial flux, it's astonishing really that Manchester United are where they are. And even though the Glazers have spent a lot of money at the football club, the way that they've handled the club and the consistentness around their decision-making, around their backing, and around their openness with the fan base is all been a little bit disappointing, I think, to many long-standing Manchester United fans that are used to success, but I also think they want a bit of openness from their owners. And like Chelsea or loathe Chelsea, there's a big contrast between Roman Abramovich and Todd Bowley. And that's what's going to be interesting for me about the Qatar bid. Right now, it seems open, it seems wonderful, it seems transparent, it seems like they want to do all of the right things, but those are just words. And if they're successful, and the same for Jim Ratcliffe as well, the key is going to be, what's the plan to make the fan base feel like they're a part of the club? What's the plan to make sure that the fan base are not ignored? What's the plan to make sure that decisions taken are consulted? What's the strategy? Is it consistent? What's the hierarchy of the club? Because if there's not that openness after you come in, then even with a ton of money, you're in exactly the same position. Yep, there might not be debt, but some of the foundational issues currently at the football club will remain. And I think that with Avram Glazer just coming back to the League Cup final, if he wasn't there, and let's say Sheikh Jassim was, or Sir Jim Ratcliffe was, then that also sends the wrong kind of message, that you've got potential suitors who are invested and you've got the Glazers that have stayed away. So they needed a representative, and they wanted a representative because it is still a trophy under them. And at the heart of this at the moment, I think, is that attachment from Avram Glazer to the club and that desire to somehow miraculously at the moment win the fan base back and get to a position where the football does the talking, and then they can spend because they've got Champions League. And imagine if Manchester United won a quadruple this season and then spent crazy amounts of money building up to next season, and the Glazers were still there, but it was Glazers plus Eric Ten Hag plus 4 trophies from last season, plus, let's just say, and don't link me with these names, they're only examples, Victor Osimhen and Jude Bellingham. Then would the Manchester United fan base, if the following season under Eric Ten Hag dominance was restored, have any kind of affection for the Glazers? And I think it's still a no, as you've said, instantly. No. But maybe the Glazers see it differently, and this is why they're exploring all options.
They see it. I don't know how they see the world. It's a very skewed perspective that they have. I'll be completely honest, and I genuinely do feel that they're probably thinking that. They're part of them going, you know what? We can bury the last 17 years as long as we do it differently from this point onwards. But it's just not possible. The bridges have been burned, blown up with nukes. And you can't rebuild that. There is a huge chasm that they just can't cross, and they will never be able to cross. And that's why this idea of it's kind of weird how we haven't. The Ineos bid's gone a little bit quiet. I suppose they both have gone quiet. They don't really need to do anything from a public perspective now until they get that due diligence, and that is done. And as we know, and as we'll say to everyone here, due diligence could take 2 weeks. Due diligence could take 2 months. It depends how in depth they really want to go into the finances before that actual formal hello, this is how much we'd like to pay for Manchester United. I think the reality, you mentioned it earlier there, that from a financial perspective, like the industry belief is that Manchester United is worth in the region of 4.5 billion, which isn't too far off what these opening offers are. The Glazers, the way I've described it to people is like selling your house. Like if all the houses on your road are being sold for like 400 grand, and you go, no, I sod that. My house is worth more, and you put your house up for 600 grand. You can put it up for 600 grand, but you're probably not going to get it. The reality is, you might get somewhere in the middle, and it's negotiations, isn't it? Do you expect the JBJ bid to? I mean, they're not going to overpay. Like as rich as the Qatari sovereign wealth fund is, and how much money there is there, they're not just going to all of a sudden go, there's 10 billion. We don't care about that, because they do care about making money. That's what billionaires want, to make more billions, right?
Yeah, and also the source of the money still comes from a private individual. That's the other factor. So people are linking it to the Qatari sovereign wealth fund and other groups potentially within Qatar, but that doesn't mean that they've been handed the money. And this is why it's going to be important, if the Sheikh Jassim bid is put through, to understand the makeup of the 9-2 foundation. And I understand that if they do get through to due diligence, there will be some clarity on other members of the group relatively quickly. And then we will be able to establish exactly where the money is from. Because if the money did come from the Qatari sovereign wealth fund, then that is when the Premier League may have questions, should an owners and directors test be carried out around what's called shadow influence. And even though Newcastle was put through, so there can be confidence, there's a precedent there. We know with the new football regulator, and also generally with the Premier League wanting to be more robust in their testing, that questions will be asked. And shadow influence, for those that are not aware, in the simplest of terms, and I will make it very basic so I don't send you to sleep, is just an owners and directors test has different aspects, a 3-year business plan, and with individuals that are tested, your directors. But then on top of that, there is a key word called control. And it's about who might, and I'm really simplifying this, control your football club. And in that consideration, the Premier League can also look at what is called shadow influence. In other words, a name that you don't list, that because of your makeup, they perceive to have direct influence over the football club. And the Premier League can ask if they allege shadow influence for extra names to be tested because they think that there is a direct possibility that they may influence the football club. And if those names fail the owners and directors test, then the group will fail the owners and directors test. So in Newcastle, because it's the easiest example to give, it was a case of a group that were not linked to the Saudi Arabian government in a legal sense in the eyes of Newcastle United. But in practical terms, PIF are a sovereign wealth fund. All of their board members are royally appointed. Their money comes from the Saudi Central Bank, which is the government bank, and their chairman is MBS. So the Premier League's argument was that MBS and the Saudi government are effectively buying the football club, so should be tested. And even though you're not listing MBS, for example, as a board member, he has shadow influence over the club and therefore should be tested. So if in Manchester United's case, Sheikh Jassim's bid was funded by QIA, then it opens the door for a variety of Premier League questions and individuals that may be sucked into it, which is why I think they've been very careful over the makeup of the group. And it's very easy to look at 9-2 Foundation, look at Sheikh Jassim as a Manchester United fan and be very excited about it. But we as journalists do have due diligence in a fair and a balanced way. And I'll always try and present both sides and not prejudge to point that out, that there is, with any sovereign wealth fund, with any rich nation, with any private individual, still always a danger until you know the makeup of the group, that there's a bigger picture at play. And in Qatar's sense, there is that wider government sports strategy. There is that drive from the Emir. So we have to be very careful as journalists to point out that there is ambition, there is excitement, there is a vision and a strategy, and there is going to be a sports washing element as well. And everyone has to make their own mind up, from fans to a regulator to the Premier League to UEFA, as to what they're comfortable with and what will or won't be acceptable in the eyes of passing the owners and directors test, and also being sufficient in terms of a model to satisfy UEFA as well. And I'm not going to go any further at this point because we don't know who the individuals are. So there's a lot of outrage. There's a lot of alleging of they're going to spend masses. They're going to be much better than the Glazers. And then at the other extreme, they're going to sports wash. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be a disaster for the Manchester United brand. And I would say both of those positions are unfair at this stage because there's not enough information out there from the group to be making those judgments. And people are jumping to conclusions based on one individual, Sheikh Jassim, or Qatar, the wider country. So we have to wait a little bit. And that's me as a journalist saying that, yes, we have a responsibility to dig and be balanced, but there's only so far you can go in a world of NDAs and in an early stage of the process. So I prefer to wait, even if that is deemed to be sitting on the fence, and then go back to sources when they clarify their makeup, so I can give the best possible context, but also the fairest possible judgment. And if after the makeup of the 9-2 Foundation is released, knowing the individuals, and I've obviously worked out in Qatar, so I've got a good knowledge of the hierarchy, I can explain it in a way that shows why it's separate, either in a legal or practical sense, I'll do that. And if at the other extreme, it becomes obvious to me that there's a much broader strategy in play, that there's a dangerous sports washing, that there's any red flags, then I'll report that as well. And hopefully, because I've been on here regularly and I try and give things in the most in-depth way as possible with all sides and balance covered, you'll understand it and you won't feel like I've got an agenda against the football club one way or the other. But I think at the moment we're just in a stage where everybody wants to leap to a conclusion. Are they going to win? Aren't they going to win? What have they bid? How quickly is it going to be done? And unfortunately, this whole process is just a little bit more complicated than that.
I appreciate the way that you've laid that out there, because I've had the same sort of accusations thrown at me about my preference of a bid, who I want, and presenting as balanced a view as I can. And you're right. Until we know a little bit more information, I think we've gone basically as far as we can go before that next step happens. I'd be particularly interested for us to have a chat around that structure of the 9-2 Foundation once those extra names come out, because I think that's really going to be that will pretty much determine whether this bid really is the best thing for Manchester United or not. Because at that point, we'll have a clear hierarchy, a clear structure, and we'll know exactly Well, not exactly, but we'll have a lot more clarity on where that money is coming from. But Ben, sorry, you want to say something?
I was just going to add on the due diligence. It's also
Yep.
worth pointing out that there's two broad approaches with any takeover. So if Rain Group follow the Chelsea path, and that would be contingent on having multiple groups that they think are credible and they want to put forwards. But if they follow the Chelsea path, then a series of groups will be shortlisted. And in the shortlisting process, a series of individuals or groups could also be paired. So Rain could say to a group, we're not putting you through as an entity, but we're happy to introduce you to another entity. And we think together you might be able to make a stronger offer. But regardless of that, if more than one is put through, then there is going to be a second stage of bidding. So in the very simplest of terms, multiple groups through, even if some are outright and some are minority, and then due diligence, and then a second round of bidding. Now, if Rain take that approach, which was the case with Chelsea, they are likely to put a deadline on the due diligence, which means that it won't take as long as it takes. It's more likely that Rain will say, this is a fair amount of time, and it's not your final offer, it's your next round of bidding. And as a consequence, the control of the timescale will be on the Rain and Manchester United side. And then there may be a third round of bidding or a singular preferred bidder put through if the Glazers wish to proceed, at which point it would be logical that there would be a period of exclusivity. And that's basically how Chelsea happened. But because there was the government, because it was a rush sale, everything was done at super speed. So that's kind of one option. And then the second aspect is later in the process, if due diligence is still being done, or if there are points of difference between buyer and seller, especially in an exclusive period, that's when it flips. And a group could say, we want more time, we're not ready to sign yet, because you're in so deep that if the Glazers are at that point committed to anything, then the incoming group, whether minority or not, has the ability to slow things down. So it could be with the next step, if it's staged and it's not a final bid, and I'd be surprised if they jump straight to that stage, then it still could be quite quick, whereby Rain say, listen, here's your feedback. We would like a second bid within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, however long they think it would take. And then from there, we'll start to get a real shape of who's in and who's not in. And more groups would usually come forwards at that point as well. So I think that's one thing to say. And then the other thing is just a quick word on Jim Ratcliffe, who hasn't really gone quiet. It's more that it's been made very clear to all groups not to make a public song and dance of this, and not to make out like their strategy in public is to improve from the Glazers, move on from the Glazers, restore the glory to Manchester United, because that all sounds very derogatory. And it can be quite counterproductive to a group to be saying what we're going to do is just do much better than the Glazers, because that's going to be quite insulting to the Glazers. And it's not the best starting point to then go and do business. And I think coming back to what we said before, even if every time I raise it, the fan base say, no, our minds can't be changed. I think the Glazers are still thinking, we don't want to leave this club at the cusp of a new era of success that we've built. And by built, I'm not going into detail about crediting. I'm just saying that in practical terms, there's a trophy in the cabinet. And if 3 more come, that is the beginning of a new era of success. And anyone can justify it in any way. You can say it's down to Casemiro's arrival, it's down to Ten Hag, it's down to getting rid of Ronaldo, it's down to whatever. But ultimately, the incumbent owner can take some credit. And whether the fan base agree with that or not doesn't matter, because everyone's got their own perspective. So if we get in the Glazers' head, which is a very difficult thing to do, particularly Avram Glazer, they may be at a point where they say, we would rather stay because we've started to see a return on the field. We've started to see a restoration of glory. And now, if we follow it through, we can leave this football club getting a higher price, but also with a better relationship with the fan base. And again, I emphasize that every fan listening will say no chance. They're just dreaming. And the fan base not changing their mind is ultimately going to be something that the Glazers are either oblivious to, or they genuinely believe that they can crack the fan base simply by winning time after time after time. We'll have to wait and see. But within that context, the Glazers have got some key considerations to make and are going to have to be unified as a family. And coming back to Radcliffe, when he spoke to Avram and Joel in the last few months of the year, just before the process started, he walked away after a direct conversation feeling like they did not want to sell. So one key question that hasn't been answered yet from the Glazer family, and if they bring on board an investor or do agree to an outright sale, I really hope they answer it, is what changed between September, October and the process starting? What changed from telling Radcliffe to his face, doesn't matter what you bid, the club is not for sale, to entering into a process where they may consider an outright sale, which means either their position has been consistent all along, that they would rather stay than go, or something has changed. And that's what really intrigues me as to an indicator as to how genuine they are. Well, and we're going to have to wait and see on that.
Well, there is a third option there, Ben, and that is that they just blind-faced lied, and they always had intentions behind the scenes, but none of that was made public until November, which...
It's possible, but you have to bear in mind that this isn't Chelsea. There's not as many outright bidders as the Glazers had hoped for. Generally, the offers are deemed to be underwhelming, and by underwhelming, I mean in the volume. As far as the value is concerned, we shouldn't read too much into it. Yeah, they're lower than the Glazers want, but that's to be expected. But the brief to the Glazers, as I understand it from sources, when this process started, came from Joe Ravage, senior figure at Rain. And he said to the Glazers, if you enter with us into a process, then I believe your football club is worth at least 6 billion. That is my understanding. And that tallies because Joe Ravage is on record as valuing Manchester United, debt aside, based on what they put into the club when they bought it. And if you ratio the return on their original investment now to 100% of the club, based upon Ravage's estimation of what they paid, it comes to about 6.5 billion. So that also tallies with sources saying that Ravage said to Manchester United, if you enter into this process, we think we can get you 6, 7, even 8 billion. And on top of that, we believe that those that enter the Chelsea process may return. So if you bring that together, the Glazers have entered into a process, trusting that process, that they're going to get 4 or 5 groups and that the end game will be 6 billion. And we wait and see, because obviously, again, they've seen the numbers and the groups haven't at this point. So if they don't choose to proceed, it won't necessarily be because they never had any intent. Otherwise, they're wasting everyone's time. It will be because they didn't get the groups and the offers that they were hopeful of at the right price. So they trusted Rain, they trusted their valuation against the Chelsea valuation. And if the market doesn't move in the direction that they believed it would, then they're not going to sell for the sake of it at what they consider to just be a cut price deal. But again, I reiterate here that don't judge the reported offers now. They're indicative. They're always going to be lower or different comparative to after you've done due diligence, when you've actually seen the numbers. And with Radcliffe, and whether or not the Glazers misled him last year, I think it'd be very strange if they did, because there's no reason, if the Glazers are prepared to sell 100% of the football club, that they wouldn't consider Sir Jim Ratcliffe. So if they told Sir Jim Ratcliffe,
true enough,
he was floating numbers of 4 billion, 4.5 billion, whatever, if they told him at that point they just didn't want to entertain a deal, and now we're still dealing with that ballpark number and Jim Ratcliffe is still in the race, it's a very strange tactic. Otherwise, the Glazers would have put a pitch out there saying we only want commercial and media rights offers and minority investment. And the last thing just to say on Ratcliffe, even though it's a little bit of a tangent, is that there is a bit of confusion about his intent versus Sheikh Jassim's intent regarding the stake in the club. So in the simplest possible way, both should be seen as outright bids. And it's just a case of Sir Jim Ratcliffe has been precise, and he's entering into a process to buy 100% of the Glazers stake, which is 69%. and then he will have to get the rest of the public shares. And you cannot guarantee that off the bat. So a lot of people quote to me Elon Musk and the manner in which he took over Twitter, but you have to do what's known as a squeeze out process in order to force a delisting. And you can only do that, I think, under UK law if you get to 90%, which means that they'd have to get from 69 to 90% before they can implement what's known as a squeeze out process. And it's likely if what's good enough for the Glazers is accepted, then the public shareholders are likely to take that as well. Yeah. So there is confidence from Sir Jim Ratcliffe he can get 100%, but it's not guaranteed, which is why he's saying majority and then from there 100%. Whereas Sheikh Jassim is saying, I can afford 100%. I'm confident in getting 100%. I'm confident in delisting the public shareholding. And therefore, I want to make it clear that if I come in, I don't want 69%, I want 100%. But Ratcliffe and Sheikh Jassim still have to go through the same process. And it is not 100% guaranteed you can just get 100% after you've agreed a deal for all of the Glazers shares. So it's semantics, but basically they both want 100% of the football club.
What I would say to finalize on that point, then you mentioned it earlier in this conversation around PR. I think you're seeing the benefit of hiring a PR firm to release your statement, because that wording would have all been taken into account. And where even though they might mean the same thing in terms of getting support of fans on side, that's an important part of the process. And that is a bit of a one-up for the Qatari bid over the Jim Ratcliffe bid, when the statement didn't even come out to the next day. It was a bit weird.
It is, but you have to look at it both ways. There's plenty of public Manchester United shareholders out of there that are worried and reticent and don't like the idea that a group is preempting a decision that, for now anyway, unless you get to that squeeze out process, is in the hands of those that have invested in Manchester United Football Club. So Ratcliffe's a businessman, and yes, the statement perhaps could have gone into more wording. And the sensible thing would have been to say, this is a process to buy 100% of the Glazers shares. Thereafter, we want 100% of the club, and we are confident and look forward to engaging with public shareholders to try and get to a position where we own 100% of the football club, which is our long-term aim. And it's step by step. And if they said that, then even though it's not as sexy as 100%, it's accurate and it's respectful to the Manchester United public shareholders. Whereas with Sheikh Jassim, it does go down well with the fan base to say debt-free 100%, but how that is received, and it may not matter because you get a snowball effect. And if they're offering to buy the shares and delist them at a competitive price, it's highly likely the public shareholders will agree to that. But again, it has to be done through proper protocol. And I think at the heart of all of this with Sir Jim Ratcliffe is a memory of the Chelsea process and having to smooth things over with Rain Group, because in that Chelsea sale process, which was run by Rain Group, Jim Ratcliffe went public when Clearlake Bowley were already in a period of exclusivity. And he suddenly said, out of nowhere, and going rogue from the process, and when it was too late to enter into the process, I want the club, I should get the club, I've got enough money to buy the club, I'm entering the race. And that didn't go down well, because he could have notified Rain, he could have entered the process, he could have tried to get shortlisted, but he came in late. And they didn't like, the Rain Group, how public and bullish Ratcliffe was when they were already almost at the point of acquisition with another group who are in Chelsea. So now I think at the Ratcliffe end, he wants to keep a bit quieter and he wants to be semantically as precise as possible to make sure that he doesn't effectively lose faith with the Rain Group.
Again.
And I've seen this in many, many takeovers with Newcastle United and Mike Ashley, with Roman Abramovich and Chelsea, even though that was a very typical sale, with Leeds United's Middle Eastern takeover, which was a few years back. The point at which you peeve off a prospective seller by being too public, too fanfare-y, too media orientated, even though with this kind of tendered process, it is a game, but the point at which you start making it a popularity contest and airing it out in public is often the point where you lose the relationship with the group that are selling. And if the Glazers, even if they get a fantastic offer, feel like that group is undermining them and starting a bit of a PR war against them, if it follows the path of, for example, Mike Ashley at Newcastle United, he'll just say, no, I don't want to talk to you anymore. You can offer me the world, but you're the wrong person to do business with because you're not following the process on my terms. And I think that's a key point. And so far, Radcliffe has learned some lessons from Chelsea, but he's still quite public. And I think that if the Rain Group and the Glazers had their way, this would stay a lot more private.
Well, Ben, as always, that's our hat trick, our trilogy completed. We're going to go for part 4, which is going to be the most exciting part, obviously. But it really is good to talk to you every time because as in-depth as they are, I like doing in-depth content. I like having the wider conversations around it. I think you cover quite a lot of that point there that you mentioned there towards the end about Ratcliffe's relationship with Rain. And yeah, it was, I found the Ratcliffe Chelsea bit odd and it coming in so late. I hadn't even thought of that. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. If you do, make sure, is it at Ben Jacobs on Twitter or is it a different name?
At Jacobs Ben. For some
reason, Jacobs Ben.
There is basically a Jacobs Ben, which is me. There's a Ben C. Jacobs, who is a very well-known Washington journalist. And sometimes he gets berated for sports stories. And sometimes I get fired political abuse at me. And then, believe it or not, there's a Ben Jacobs who's private and has 1 follower. And I don't think has ever tweeted, but seems to have had that handle since day 1. And nobody really knows who he is. And I would like that handle, but for now it remains at Jacobs Ben.
At Jacobs Ben. Well, if you'd like to follow Jacobs Ben, or as we know, Ben Jacobs, then he's on Twitter. And hopefully we can have another conversation. As I said, maybe next week after we've got a little bit more information back from the Rain Group and we do get a bit of clarity on the 9-2 foundation and the structure of that. I'd love to talk about that. But as always, Ben, really appreciate your time. And I'm sure the community appreciates it as well. Thank you very much.
Look forward to it. All the best, everyone.